The western lowlands of Furel are something to be admired if ever you have the chance. The water there sparkles a type of blue you could never begin to imagine. Houses lined rivers that stretched into the woods behind our little town, and you could hardly walk 10 feet without nearly being tripped by some group of kids running about. Women and men would walk the streets, exchanging in talk of the galactic markets, or the newest conflict between the Federation and the Republic. In all, our life was boring, but in a good way. It was boring in all the ways that you wanted a life to be. We always knew what the next day had in store for us. At the time, I was only 14, and I think I took some part of that for granted. Even looking back now, I can understand why. My parents were scavengers, plain and simple. Furel was loaded with tech from its last war, so it wasn't exactly difficult to find a haul, pull out the good parts, and bring them back to sell. It wasn't exactly a glamorous job, but it put food on the table for us. As I said, though, I always seemed to look for more. Oft one would find the kids of Cerelia Raw around the waterfront, swimming about with the turtles and other fish of the sea. You might find others along the golden-white rocky mountain paths that seemed to stretch infinitely along the coast. The one place we were not to enter alone was the forest. You would be sure to find me there, even after the multiple scoldings I'd received. You'd always find the most interesting things there, though, so how could I resist? I remember the last day I entered those woods. It was a colder day, a sharp wind blowing through our town. Blackwater, our system's star, hung low in the horizon, threatening to dip almost as soon as it had risen, casting long shadows across us all. My feet pattered along the wet ground as I ran through the town, leaving deep marks in the mud and dirt. A grin stretched across my face as water splashed up, staining the black canvas of my pants, leaving grimy prints across my legs. My destination wasn't far, a small household at the end of the block. Stopping to catch my breath as I pulled up, I took a moment to take the home in. It was much the same as almost any home in the town, a whitish-gray portable colony house that had been put up years ago now. I didn't know when Cerelia Raw had been settled, but it was long before I'd been around. Despite its similarities to all the homes around it, this one seemed to stand out. Plants imported from around the galaxy bloomed from within windows, searching their way out into the open air to find the sun. Seamless improvements had been added on, such as a fireplace and a chimney that puffed smoke from its tip. I took a deep breath, knocked, and waited, tugging at my jacket, straightening my collar, trying to look the slightest bit presentable. When the door slid open, a heavy-set man stood in the way. A thick, black, caterpillar-like mustache hung over his mouth, tickling at his lip as he spoke, looking at me under bushy eyebrows.
William.
His tone was flat, almost disappointed.
What do you want?
Hello, Mr. Alani,
I said, trying to appear as chipper and innocent as possible.
I was just wondering if Morel might be free for a few hours.
He sighed, getting on one knee, his eyes meeting mine.
Ortel.
He reached forward and straightened my collar.
You heading back out there?
He eyed the line of trees in the distance. With a smile on my face, I shook my head no, and he sighed.
Alright, son. You know there's no need to lie to me.
He stood up, limping back into the house. I ducked inside, bathed in an orange glow as candles lined the edge of the room, taking a seat on a plush couch just under the window. Brown furs were draped from the walls, and the room smelled of cinnamon. It was familiar, almost more than my own home at this point. Mr. Ilani cupped his hands to his mouth, calling out,
Morel! Ortel's here to see you.
A pair of footsteps could be heard clambering down the steps. A young woman stopped at the end of the stairway, her hands locked to the rail, looking in my direction with a spark in her eyes. A toothy grin stretched across her face as she vaulted over the banister, landing softly on the carpet. She ran over and pulled me to my feet. Her dad rolled her eyes, pointing to us.
Back before sundown now, the both of you. Understood?
We gave him a nod and ran out as he let out a breath. Outside, Morel stopped me, turning me about.
Right. Before we do anything...
She grabbed a handful of my red hair, pulling it back. I winced for a moment as she tied it up into a ponytail.
There we go.
She dusted off her hands. I rubbed the back of my head, turning back to her. Morel and I had been friends since we were children. We'd grown up together and explored together. Hell, the first time I'd secretly gotten drunk had been with her. She stood a little taller than me, with moss-green eyes and hair dark as water at night. Her olive skin seemed to glow like a fire in Furel's sun. Her adventurous spirit was the only one in the whole town that seemed to rival my own. I straightened myself up, brushing up my coat as she eyed me.
Okay, so...
She dragged me along, beginning to walk toward the woods.
What's the new gossip?
Alright, get this. I turned to face her, walking backward. I was out there the other day, and you'll never guess what I stumbled across. I held my hands up in front of me, my boots sloshing through the thick mix below me. Morel tapped her chin in mock inquisitiveness.
Let me guess. It was another old crusty Furin temple.
She raised an eyebrow to look at me. I pouted a little at her. Well, you didn't have to put it that way. I huffed, before turning back to the trees. Alright, yeah, it was another temple, but this one was different. Morel was silent, so I continued. This one had ash in it. I looked back at her. Her brow was furrowed, not seeming to put the same links together I had. You know, soulless ash. You shoot them and they burst into the stuff. I spun back around before feeling her hand tighten onto my shoulder.
Whoa. Wait.
I looked back up. Her face was stern.
Listen, I'm all about exploring the woods, but soulless stuff is dangerous.
I scoffed. Well, yeah, but like... I patted my chest. I'm a scavenger. I'm used to handling old, dangerous tech. She seemed unpersuaded. Morel, just think of all the cool stuff we'll find in there. I clasped my hands together. She took a moment before letting out a long, deep breath.
All right, fine.
She patted my arm as she hopped ahead of me.
Since I can't convince you, the least I can do is make sure you don't get yourself in too much trouble.
I grinned, running off after her. Ferns and thin vines whipped past us as we hurried through the trees. There wasn't much light left in the day, so we had to be quick about it. The winter months never had many hours of daylight, and some days the sun never came out at all. The air was frigid, and you could tell it wouldn't be very long till the snow would start to come down, and the rivers would freeze over. Doing this wouldn't be possible once that happened. That's when things would get boring. We had to do this now. I squeezed my way between two trees into a small grove, flicking on a small flashlight. Barely any light broke through the dense canopy, especially at this time of year. Dead leaves and rocks littered the ground as I popped through, feeling the wet mulch squelch under me. Morel looked around as I stopped.
So, where is it?
I smiled, kneeling down, beginning to brush aside the leaves and dirt to reveal a half-rusted metal door surrounded by intricately carved stone, inlaid with shimmering purple and blue crystal. I reached for the latch, grunting as I began to pull it open. Got my foot caught in the hole when I was out here the other day. The door made a loud whump as it hit the dirt. Birds squawked, fluttering away. A steep stairway led into the black below. Morel pursed her lips at me, looking in.
So that's how you twisted your ankle.
It was well hidden. Not my fault it was all covered in plants. She looked up at me.
You're telling me you went in here with a twisted ankle?
I mean, it wasn't that bad. I only went in a little bit. She shook her head. Hesitantly, she took a step onto the stone. Once she was sure of her footing, she began to descend. I followed closely behind her, reaching my hand up over her shoulder to shine our light further in. Down and down we went until the narrow tunnel opened into a massive chamber. Our every step echoed across the vastness of the temple. our nostrils hit with the smell of 1,000 years of age. As I shined my light across the walls, we found ourselves met with statues that stood to the ceiling of alien warriors, their bodies protected by carapace and shell, but their skin scaly and reptilian underneath it. Many wielded weapons from a time long ago, or makeshift mining gear as armor. Morel regarded it all with attention, gaping at the sheer size of these things. As we reached the bottom, we looked up at them. It almost felt as if their eyes bore holes through us. I swallowed, taking a deep breath as I looked forward, searching the ground. We heard a crunch and looked down, seeing the pile of ash left across the ground. We kneeled beside it, and I swiped my finger across it, leaving a line through it as my finger was stained black. Morel slapped at my hand.
Don't touch it! Who knows what it'll do to you?
What's the worst it can do? It's ash. I stood up as she muttered.
My pa says that stuff will turn you into one of them.
I rolled my eyes, spinning back around on my heels. Relax, I'm fine. I'm not gonna turn into one of them creepy little... I gestured with my arms, faking my hands as being big swords gently chopping at her shoulders. She laughed, pushing me off her.
All right, fine. You aren't gonna turn into one of them.
She stood up and wiped off my finger.
Still probably a bad idea to touch it.
I sighed. Fine. Let's just look around and see if we find anything cool. We began moving deeper inside. As I swept my light over the ground, the beam passed over something pale and white. I jumped back briefly, bumping into Morel. She didn't say anything, but rather steadied out my hand, pointing it at a pile of bones on the ground. I grimaced a little, seeing it lying on its side, the ribs broken in. It was a furin, much like the ones in the statues. Red marks lined the shell on its head, almost completely faded with time. It had some sort of primitive rifle clutched in its hands. Instinctively, I began to reach for it.
The dead should be left to their lives beyond.
A voice broke through the silent darkness. Morel and I shrieked, turning about. Our light shined on a figure that towered over us like a mountain. He was Furin, his face wrinkled and grizzled with age. Scars lined his skin, and his beady black eyes struck us like arrows. He looked to the bones behind us.
That one was married. You can tell by their marks.
He said, before looking back to me.
But those who would love to rest in their peace.
Slowly and shakily, I nodded, as did Morel. He cleared his throat, leaning down to look at us.
What are you doing out here? Cerulean kids are restricted from the forest, are they not?
Sir, we were just curious of what was out there. We didn't.
He cut her off.
So, you are here when you are not supposed to be?
We nodded, looking at the ground. The old Furin sighed.
It's dangerous here. Come, I will take you back.
We nodded, following him. He held us both at the shoulders, guiding our way to the surface. The sun had just hit the mountains in the distance. A few more minutes and it would be dark. The old Furin turned around, shutting the door to the temple, tracing a sigil over it. The handle glowed blue for a moment before fading out. He reached out, spreading dirt and leaves over it. Curiously, I tapped his shoulder. He looked up. Sir? What was that? He grunted.
Magic. I sealed the entrance so no one else can enter.
I tilted my head. I thought Furins didn't have magic. He paused for a moment before finishing up, patting the soil.
It can always be learned.
There was a somber tone in his voice as he looked at the entrance to the temple.
Let us go.
He turned, guiding us. As we moved closer and closer to the town, something felt off. A scent lingered in the air, something like burning. He seemed to smell it too. Looking up at him, I could see a worried look on his face. It was when we broke through the tree line that our worries were confirmed. A fire from the depths of hell spread over the town, erupting it in a blaze of orange. And that's when I saw it. A ship hung low over the water, black as pitch, with sharp square edges and an eerie purple glow. The worst part was its engines, roaring with an ungodly howl. Soulless. Furin stood in shock for a moment, enough time to break free from his grasp. I felt him try to grab at me again as he shouted.
Child, wait!
I heard him grunt as Morel broke free as well. She sprinted after me as I ran into the town. She grabbed me, dragging me under a building as a pale figure jumped down. We watched as a woman was dragged down into the dirt. A look of horror flashed over her face in one moment before a bone-like blade was driven through her chest. We watched it sink deeper into her, getting a clearer view of her attacker. A grotesque form, skin dry and pale, muscles pulsating as it leaned down, its head drawn closer to hers. It was featureless, save for an arcane symbol etched into it. We saw the black pit in its chest seem to suck the very life from her as we watched her very being change, seeming to match that of her attacker. I looked on in horror before scrambling back. Morel stood beside me on the other side.
Soulless? But,
I started, looking to her.
weren't they only in the Republic territory? What are they doing here? Where are the Celestials, the Federation?
She put a finger to my lips.
William! We don't have time for questions. We need to get out.
I took a deep breath, my body shaking as I nodded. She looked around, pointing.
There! Shuttles! We need to go.
She grabbed my shirt, pulling me along. The streets were filled with these creatures, dragging people from homes and slaughtering them. In the distance, we could hear the sound of weapons firing, holding off the soulless from the shuttles. We passed by an alley, looking out into the main road. I turned to look, and immediately knew I shouldn't have. Morel stopped too as we watched our father dragged out. The skinnier one, this one with long, razor-sharp claws, had its hands wrapped around his throat. He struggled, punching and kicking, and he looked at us. He yelled for us to move, but I couldn't. He screamed and waved, but I watched as the other hand plunged into his chest. Blood spewed from his lips as time seemed to move again. I grabbed Morel. I could only assume what happened to my family, and part of me didn't want to know. I pulled us past the last row of buildings, seeing the lines of gunmen firing past us. I caught a whiff of ash as a bullet whizzed past, hitting something directly behind us. Ducking past the soldiers, we entered the mob of hysterical townspeople. Morel was still in shock, her eyes wide, her breathing ragged. I couldn't say I was much better. I coughed, realizing now how much my lungs burned from the smoke. We felt the ground shake as a building exploded, sending us to the ground. One of the shuttles attempted to take off, but the shockwave sent it back into the water. The fire was spreading fast, and the soulless were approaching. The soldiers were screaming at us to get on the shuttles, to get out. Morel composed herself enough to get up and pull me on. The shuttle rumbled as the doors closed, the only light being through a small window on the side. I pressed myself to it, my knuckles white as I gripped the sill, staring out as we lifted off. My chest tightened as I saw the smoke rising from the town, blotting out the sky. Tears welled in my eyes as Morel put her hands on my shoulder. As we exited the atmosphere, I continued to watch, seeing one soulless ship after another begin to pour into the system. The Celestials, our so-called protectors, were nowhere to be found. I think some part of me died that day. I stepped back, out of Morel's arms, gripping the rail on the ceiling. I looked first at the ground, then to the pilot.
Where will we go?
The pilot kept their eyes forward.
To Dryanica.
It sounded like they were trying to hold on to some hope that everything would be okay. But you could hear the cracks in it.
We hope they'll take us.
I nodded, looking back out at Furel, my home, in flames.
Hey kid,
I looked back to them.
You'll be okay, right?
I sighed, and then I began to just sob, tears rolling down my cheeks as I curled up, Morel beside me, but in the end broke down as well. After what felt like hours, I just couldn't cry anymore. There was nothing left. Morel had fallen asleep. The others in the shuttle weren't looking much better. Many were injured or burned. Solemnly, I stood up, looking out the front of the ship to the new planet. Dranica, they'd called it. Our sister planet. One spot over in the system. I could only hope that what lay there was better than where we'd come at this point. I didn't have much more to hold on to. Minutes later, we'd gotten clearance to land in a port just outside of one of the cities. Everyone was woken, each of us told to stand and be ready to be received. Morel and I stood close. As the doors opened, we were greeted by the dull brown, hot, rocky landscape. We looked to each other, linked arms, and stepped out into our new lives.